an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The executive director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid. Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility on this Monday. And today, I believe, is the 16th day of November. It's hard to believe that next Thursday, a week from Thursday, is Thanksgiving. And of course, it used to be in the good old days that was the beginning of the so-called holiday season. But I think we've, for purposes of making money, we've kind of expanded the holiday season to the point that no sooner did it end early in the year than it begins pointing towards the fall of the year. Seems like, anyway. My wife has been watching Christmas movies on Hallmark Channel for 3 weeks. So, anyway, it is a pleasure to be with you on this Monday. It is here in our area a beautiful Monday, although I know that we do have some clouds in the sky, and the absolutely delightful weekend that we had is pretty much on its way out with a very, very nice day so far today. It looks like we're going to be clouding in and getting some rain over the next couple of days. But we haven't had the real bitter cold weather yet, and that's really good. I've talked to a lot of people who say as long as it doesn't snow, I can take these temperatures forever. So anyway, it is a pleasure to be with you. It's a very, very difficult day, as it has been weekend for most of us, I know, with the situation that unfolded Friday night in Paris. Like everybody else, it's one of those issues that you can't get away from. And the reality is we really don't want to get away from it, because we're hoping that if we read enough and listen enough, that somebody's going to give us the answer to this. And of course, the fact is the answer is not quite as simplistic as we would like it to be. I was telling Bob before we came on the air that I was just watching President Obama's fielding questions at a press conference in Turkey at the close of the summit there, the G20 summit that he's visiting in Turkey. That you, of course, understandably, you may remember, is the one that President Hollande of France chose not to attend because of the situation at home in France. But it was very, very interesting to listen to the questions and the comments of the media, of the reporters, the journalists and reporters who were sitting in the audience at this press conference. And it was very interesting because I listened to it for about 20 minutes, just the last 20 minutes before we came on the air. It was still on when I turned the television off to begin our program today. But one of the things that occurred to me was that every question being asked in the same ways was the same question, if that makes sense. And it was asked in different ways, it was phrased in different ways, but essentially it was the same question being asked in a variety of different perspectives and directions. Finally, the fourth such question was from a member of the media. I didn't catch his name. And he said, "Excuse me for being blunt, Mr. President." And then he said, I know I'm speaking for a lot of people, not only here, but throughout the world, people that I've talked to, and they want to know why we just don't take out those bastards." And the president's response was, well, the last three questions I've answered were answers to that question. And the most interesting part of the very brief 15 minutes of listening to the press conference that I did, the thing that I found most interesting were not the president's answers as much as the questions, because all the questions were indeed pointing in the same direction. And in sharing that little bit of information with Bob Kincaid before we went on the air here at the Virtual Center today, I mentioned the fact that it's really frightening because chances are what we end up doing is not going to be the right thing, if indeed there is a right thing. We tend to operate in either or, right and wrong choices in this world, and sometimes there aren't right choices. But we're probably going to end up doing the wrong thing because we tend to respond to the pressure which is so overwhelming to do the wrong thing. And this is just me talking. I posted a little piece on Facebook the other day and on this particular issue, and I think everybody did, because everybody was moved to say something, as was I. So I'll just share very quickly what I said. And I said, I, like all of the civilized world, am appalled by what happened in Paris on Friday. But what frightens me even more than the brutality and inhumanity of the attacks is the call for retribution we are hearing from so many sources. Getting even seems to be the easiest, most logical response. An eye for an eye. What complicates the picture well beyond the easiest and most logical is that this is exactly the response that those responsible for Paris want us to take. It's pretty clear that no motive other than trying to provoke an in-kind response makes any sense. And that is quite consistent with the 7th century views that are driving the terror that is ISIS. Check out the feature story in The Atlantic, especially the dramatic differences between ISIS and Al-Qaeda. I did receive an email from one of our listeners who pointed out that there were several articles in the Atlantic. The one I was referring to was a one written by an author whose last name is Woods, and I can't remember his first name, but it was a detailed 35 to 40 page analysis. It was published toward the beginning of the summer in Atlantic, and I believe it's been republished there, about what ISIS is really about their religious beliefs and where they are similar and where they are differences from other groups within Islam and all the rest of it. But if you read that article, you can begin to understand that there are serious, important things about this particular group that we need to know and we need to appreciate. The fact of the matter is we tend not to do that. We tend to follow our inclinations to the point that we logically assume that ISIS, Al-Qaeda, it doesn't matter, they're all the same. The fact of the matter is they are not all the same. And as an example, to ISIS, bin Laden was the epitome of the enemy because he represented the modernism that ISIS is driven to crush. To assume that both are the same and to base what we do next on that assumption is sure to get us into more trouble, not less. That was my point in the article. Besides, I said, and this was me talking, there's something quite wrong with letting terrorists choose the weapons, so to speak. When we agree to get down in the mud with an enemy, we lose the contest before it even begins. Let's make up our minds to prevail in this, but let's try to do it in ways that prove that the way of life we love, the one that they hate so much, is indeed as superior as we think it is. My concern is, and again, revenge is, it makes one feel so good. there's something exciting about it. Let me give you an example of that, an analogy which is probably inappropriate given the seriousness of the topic. But as many of you know, because of the fact that I was born and raised in New England, I'm a big New England Patriots fan. And of course I was quite disturbed all year by the so-called Deflategate issue and all the rest of it, and the suspension of Brady and all of that. But anyway, like everybody else, I've been witness to the fact that this year there seems to be a little bit something extra driving Brady. It's almost like he feels like he has something to prove, and he's going to try to take it out on the entire league to do it. And yesterday, as many of you are aware, I'm sure, New England was able to pull out a last-minute victory with 1 second to go, a field goal, over the New York Giants, and won by 2 points. And every other aspect of that game they should have lost. But the most interesting thing was that as that field goal was made, the cameras focused on Brady on the sideline. And Brady's expression was incredible. It was almost like, yeah, you know. And it seemed like, yet again, there was an opportunity for him, if indeed there is some sort of a payback issue. Everybody seems to think there is, to a degree. I don't know. There's something that makes one feel good about that. But the fact of the matter is, when we know that that response is exactly what the terrorists want us to do, when we know that much of what they do, especially the brutality associated with the way they do it, is designed principally to provoke us, then it seems to me that it's worth taking the time to try to figure out exactly what it is that will not play directly into the response that they want. That's my feeling. And again, and Bob and I were chatting, and you know, there's obviously ISIS could never do what it's able to do without the kind of money, the flow of revenue that's coming into it from a lot of places, and a lot of very responsible places that we have relationships with as a nation. So there's something that ISIS is doing that conforms with or seems to be appropriate for the people that are helping to fund this. And it seems to me incumbent that we do everything we can to find out what's going on and to try to come up with ways to act that would be appropriate and positive. In response to that piece that I put on Facebook on Saturday, one of our regular listeners responded to that. And this, first of all, I want to acknowledge the piece, but I also want to say that this was a response to that little piece that I put on Facebook. And it is a response driven by what I put. In other words, it's dialogue. It's conversation. It's using the internet, it seems to me, for the instructional communication purposes that make it so exciting. And one of the reasons that I wanted to even have a Facebook page connected to the Virtual Center is that it gave us an opportunity to post points of view and issues and perspectives that are worthy of and will generate conversation, dialogue, and maybe lead in the process to some solutions of some pretty difficult, complicated things. Well, this particular piece was in response to this, and it's about ISIS. And let me say that this is from Horst, and I don't think I have asked him several times before if he minded that I identify him. He doesn't, so I'm assuming that this will be okay. And he basically said, in response to my piece, let me just say that I've noticed the same trend that you have. And then he says, to a much lesser extent, because I'm not immersed in my daily environment like you are. And of course we know that Horst is not located within the continental United States. I find it equally disturbing, he says, for all the same reasons. People whose opinion I respect highly are bandying about with words like evil and urging fierce action to, quote, take off the gloves. And Horst asks the question, what have we been doing already? We had the gloves on. When reports tell us that something like 70% of the casualties that we inflict in our ongoing anti-terror efforts abroad are not the intended targets, and to somehow nip this problem in the bud as if by doing so had always been readily available to us, and that we just lacked the national will to do it. He said, I find particularly chilling the couching of the ISIS threat in terms of the battle between good and evil, because it has a conveniently built-in justification for any atrocities and collateral damage that we may inflict as we go about our mission, automatically by its very nature predestined to failure of ridding the world of terror, this time for good. In other words, when you define the issue as good versus evil, you basically unleash all the options. Because if you believe that you're fighting evil, you can justify whatever happens in pursuit of efforts to destroy evil, even if it costs innocent civilian lives and all the rest of it. In other words, when you define it as an us versus them, good versus evil struggle, you basically cause things to happen which probably aren't even in your mind when you frame the issue that way. Horst said, it's lazy on an intellectual level, while simultaneously satisfying both emotionally and viscerally. It identifies our enemy in broad terms, while dehumanizing them sufficiently that we may feel comfortable abandoning the very values which supposedly ennoble us over them in pursuit of righteous revenge. I couldn't agree more. I think what it does, as he said, intellectually it's lazy. It's easy. It's a too easy way. But the fact of the matter is it rationalizes a lot of things that most of us would never do consciously. And then he talked about Tom Friedman in the New York Times. And he said, I cringe in anticipation of what Tom Friedman's going to do with this. And then he makes the comment that he knows that in the past I've been very, very supportive of Tom Friedman's ability to take very complex things and explain them in ways which help us understand and make sense. And I have said more than once that I believe, and I'm not the only one who says this, that probably there's nobody in the field of journalism right now that knows more about this particular part of the world than Tom Friedman. And so in a sense, what many of us know about the Middle East, about that part of the world, comes primarily from the fact that Tom Friedman knows so much. But what bothers Horst, and let me say that I don't disagree with him here. What bothers him, he said, what I found distasteful about Friedman over the years is what you might call the brand he's selling, unquote. To my lights, he takes unworthy or occasionally outrageous ideas and renders them palatable for consideration by sensible people. A recent example is taking ISIS and comparing them to the villain in Batman, noting that some people just want to watch the world burn, with the implication that ISIS is an entire army of insane, nihilistic individuals, when in fact they are a coherent group with a common ideology, goal, and religious fervor, all of which have their roots in a very real world of culture, history, war, and direct suffering, rather than simply some inborn thirst for blood or some unknowable, mysterious source of disaffection with humanity and all it considers sacred and good. I mean, that's a beautiful piece of thinking, I believe, and it's extremely insightful. Basically, what he says is that, and I think this is significant. One of the reasons I wanted to do this, because I really believe that Horst is onto something here. And what I mean is that Friedman's reputation has become so accepted. I mean, I just said that there's probably nobody in the world of journalism that knows more about the Middle East, about that part of the world and what we need to do there and the different branches and different sides and issues and all of this. The mere fact that Friedman is honored for that is the issue. It's the same issue we've been talking about. If what you think about a particular subject becomes so generally accepted that your thoughts become definitive, then by definition that's a problem. We talked about that with the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. If you remember, we focused on Carl Becker's approach to the Declaration as Lockean, and we talked about Charles Beard's approach to the Constitution, focusing on the self-interest of the founders. And the fact of the matter is, these two studies became so generally accepted that they became definitive. And what that meant was that they tended to define everything about that subject that occurred afterwards. The danger of that is that it establishes limits to what people will accept and what people won't accept. Going to the old idea of thinking out of the box. When someone becomes definitive on a particular topic, they are in effect defining the parameters of the box. And because they are accepted as the expert in that particular area, then seemingly, if it doesn't come or fall within the parameters of their box, it's outlandish, it's not acceptable. And Horst says this about Friedman, and he's right. Because what he's saying is that because of this level of respect that Friedman has garnered over the years, and I have to say in his defense that all of it is not unfounded. He's incredibly insightful. But the fact of the matter is, because he's Tom Friedman, that has come to mean that what he thinks carries more weight than what other people think, even if what he thinks on a particular issue might be far-fetched, might be absurd. And to make that point, Horst gave me a link to YouTube, to a YouTube interview that Charlie Rose had with Tom Friedman on the Iraq War. And the question that Charlie Rose asked Tom Friedman was, now that you've had a chance to look back and see what's happened and all the rest of it, do you believe that the Iraq War was justified?
Bill, we have a
Yes.
call. Sorry to interrupt, but we have a call.
Oh, that's okay. How are you?
Fine. How are you?
I'm great, thank you.
Trying to get back in the saddle, but we have John on the line for you.
Oh, that'd be great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, John. Hello, John. Hello, John.
Work with me for 1 second, Bill.
Okay.
Hold on.
That's okay. Take your time. Hello, John. Hello, John.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Hey, I sure can. Welcome.
Okay. Yeah, but Gremlins have gotten hold of us, which is not surprising. The
Oh,
world is
no.
falling apart.
Well, Agnes is producing the program today, and that's wonderful because she is wonderful. But sometimes if you don't do this on a regular basis, you forget a few things, and so that's the problem. The most important thing is that you are here, and it's wonderful to hear from you.
Oh, thank you much. I just thought I would try to bring up a couple of things that I think may or may not be instructive. And
Right.
There has been some conversation about it, so I may not necessarily be bringing up anything so-called new.
All right.
But the leadership of the ISIL or ISIS or whichever name incarnation you want to call them, the thing about it is that their top leadership and their core commanders and stuff, these are all to a large extent these are Baathists that when the United States went in and blew the hell out of Iraq, they pushed them they disbanded the army, these people lost, quote unquote, their jobs, they lost their livelihoods, their families went hungry, and then you top it off with, blowing up their families and doing all this other stuff. I mean, I think to some extent, and I'm kind of got to be careful of this because of the rather hot knee-jerk reaction everybody's having right now, but
Right.
this thing to me just sounds like it's more occasion of, the chickens coming home to roost than anything else.
I understand where you're coming from, and there's no way in the world, and I mean, people can say there's more to it, John, and disagree with you, but they can't deny that what you're saying is valid. It may not be as the most important thing to other people as it is to you, but what you're saying is valid. And when you say Baathists, you're talking about the group that was headed by Saddam Hussein. These are the people that when we toppled Saddam, these were the people that had been in positions of power under him that we just pushed out. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, they had positions of power. And now, the thing about it is that most of the people in that society, it's like being a Baptist was just about the same as being a Democrat or Republican carrying a voter card.
Right.
But it was required in order to have a job, in order to get promoted
Sure.
to up the ranks,
Oh, sure.
stuff
Yeah.
like that. And then when you had L. Paul Bremer go in there and become the viceroy of freaking Iraq, and he put that policy in place, he took essentially the most educated, the most trained and talented people in that country, and he threw them out on the street for all practical intents and purposes.
Yeah, and so this is what you mean by chickens coming home to roost, that these people now are in leadership positions with ISIS.
Well, yeah, I mean, this whole thing is, it's kind of like the whole thing with like Iran.
Right.
People forget that the United States sponsored a coup in Iran in the 1950s, mid-1950s.
1953, right.
that toppled the elected government there in order to install the Shah. The United States has been involved in the Middle East, pretty much for most of the 20th century. And a lot of that manipulation has left multi-generations of people that have a freaking axe to grind with the West.
Right.
And a lot of people forget, wars used to be fought, 18th century, reflecting the wonderful work that you do. In fact, your mind oftentimes falls back into the 18th century. They used to line up in nice beat rows and shoot the shit out of each other.
Yeah.
Well, nowadays, no one reasonably thinks that, an Iraqi army is going to come across Fort Meade, Maryland anytime soon. These people are not capable of waging what you would call a regular war.
No.
And yet they are pushed against the wall, and I'm just as appalled as anybody else would be about what's going on. But if you stop and you take the emotion out for a moment and look at it from their point of view, these attacks, you could almost say, are literally the only way they can fight back.
I understand. John, I'm telling you, your comments are absolutely fabulous because they are right on target. And I think what you're saying is something that everybody needs to think about before we jump to our first conclusions, because our first conclusions are probably not going to be the right ones.
Well, I mean, I listened to a guy, and let's, for the sake of argument, let's take his idea and trot it out and walk it around a little bit, let it peel the grass.
Mm-hmm.
In the old days, if you had a problem, like say the old British Empire or whatever, if you had a problem with some country and you fought a war, what did you do? When you won, you took the place over and you added it on to whatever it is you got.
Mm-hmm.
It became a colony, it became a state, whatever. And at least you could argue that the blood and treasure you spent, you got something for it.
Right.
And you've taken care of the problem. But the United States has gotten into a habit now of going in, stirring up the pot, getting into wars, and then trying to back out, cleaning up the mess after the wars are fought.
Uh-huh.
And then what happens? You've got people whose economies are shattered. You've got their lives, they've got relatives that have been killed. Every time Obama fires off a drone and blows up a wedding party, he might kill 2 top terrorists and 50 other people.
That's right. That's right.
And what you going to get? You're going to get the families of 50 more people who now who've got nothing better to do but to dream about ways of getting revenge.
That's right.
And
John, you're exactly right, and your sense of history is so important to this. It is so important to keep these things in mind. It doesn't mean that we don't have the right to try to respond, but we do have the responsibility, it seems to me, to try to do something that will fix things that might have been not the right things to do, rather than just make it worse. And that's what I'm afraid we'll do. That's what I'm afraid we'll do.
Well, that's what I'm hearing. I hear it all weekend long. All the little truck stops I stopped at all weekend long.
Right.
The term, let's turn them into glass, was repeated I don't know how many times.
Right. Right.
And
on the Democratic debate Saturday night, the same. One of the things that Bernie Sanders said, which I thought was particularly pertinent, was that in reference to ISIS, that this is a different kind of enemy than we've ever encountered before, but we're doing it in the same ways. That he points out that the vast bulk of this huge defense budget we've got is being spent in preparation for a Cold War that no longer exists.
Yeah, or one that they're trying to gin up with Russia or China.
That's exactly right. They're exactly right, John.
Yeah. I mean, but that's fantastic if you want to sell more bombers and more, spy systems and more computer and cyber warfare and everything else. But, and to steal a term from a few years ago, back when Bin Laden was still running around, you're going out and tracking people down in the middle of nowhere that live in the mountains, live in the caves, that are little small networks in the middle of cities someplace. It takes a whole different kind of warfare, and we're not geared for that.
No.
I'm afraid that if we do get geared for that, then anything that we call freedom in this country is going to be a shadow and a memory.
That's right.
Of a police state that would be absolutely disastrous.
And if we do that, we lose.
Yeah, well, remember, if you think back about one of Bin Laden's videos that came out fairly early on during the hunt for him, and it was an interview he had done before 9/11, and he said the way to destroy the United States is to destroy its economy. And the way to do that is to get them to spend themselves into oblivion.
Right. Which is kind of interesting. That's been the right's approach to the budget for social programs also.
Yeah.
Is just get us to spend to the point that there's nothing left to spend. Therefore, you got to change your whole operating procedure. And that's what Bin Laden's talking about. I think there's something to that. And that's what I'm saying. We've got to basically begin to use what we know to our advantage instead of putting it aside. I don't know if you were able to hear, but the president's press conference today, he was struggling trying to explain this to the people because the questions were the same. They kept, why don't you do that? Why don't we do this? Why don't we do that? And it's all basically exactly what ISIS wants us to do.
Well, yeah, they want us to bring the fight to the Muslim lands.
Right.
They want us to be the infidel invader that will stir them up into the massive.
Right. And it will make it a lot easier for them to recruit members and all the rest of it. I mean, it's just, and that's the last thing we want to do is play into that mess.
Yeah, but the problem is you got too many people like we have in this country that, again,
Yep.
Now they're all stirred up. You got France now has gone on some major bombing runs over the weekend in the first part of the week. I mean, they're blowing the hell out of everything. And so you keep saying we don't want to get into it, but I got a feeling that path is already, that horse has already run out of the barn.
Yeah, I think you're right. I do think you're right, John. Yeah. John, thank you so much.
Let me let you go there.
All right, buddy. Thank you very, very much. You've added a whole lot. Thank you. And Agnes, thank you for putting the call through. It was terrific. Just checking the time, we're about 40. We've just gone beyond 40 minutes of the hour, so we've taken about first 40 minutes of our first hour on this issue, and I think it's an important one. And I think what John added when he goes all the way back to the Shah, and of course you go all the way back to the end of World War I and the dividing up of the Middle East as part of the Balfour Declaration, and as part of the assigning of portions of the Middle East to the victorious nations in World War I. In other words, we carved up an area of the world that was considered to be rich in resources, and of course that's oil, and we made sure that everybody had an area to exploit after World War I. And that's when this whole issue of exploitation of that region began. There's absolutely no question. And the fact of the matter is, Gaddafi and Saddam and the power structures that emerged in that part of the world as a response to what we, and when I say we, I mean generally the West, what we helped create there is entirely understandable, and because it doesn't conform to our definitions in this day and age of right and wrong, and therefore we ought to replace, topple existing struggles, when in fact they are structured by what the situation they are in call for. In other words, they were appropriate given the priorities and the challenges of the particular area in which these people lived. And for us to go in there as not as a nation necessarily, but as part of a civilization, a different civilization, and go in there and speak and seek to replace that with something that better conforms to our definitions of right and wrong and civilized as opposed to uncivilized and all the rest of it, is bound to get us in more trouble, not less. But I want to thank John so very, very much for his sharing his thoughts with us, and again, when he called, it reminds me that I didn't take the time at the beginning to share with you the phone number, and so I want to do that. Our phone number is area code 304-640-6495. 304-640-6495. My email address, if you'd like to communicate with me that way, one-on-one, my email address is waobrien906 at gmail.com. waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906 at gmail.com. And again, our Facebook page, if you go to Facebook and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will gain access to our Facebook page. I've posted a number of things on there, and it's to one of those that Horst's response related to this particular situation in Paris this past Friday was written, and I want to thank him for that, and I want to thank John for his call. And again, I think what we're into here is something that all of us need to, it doesn't mean that we care for or are less sympathetic to the pains of the French people. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is using our knowledge and our abilities to the point that when we do decide to do something, it's something that will make a bad situation better, not worse. And I think that's something that I believe all of us could support. I know that I do. I wanted to return as part of our program, and of course you have to deal with the Paris situation. You just can't do an interactive program like this and not deal with that. It is so much on everybody's mind. It's everywhere. But if you remember, when we were last together last Wednesday, we were dealing with another issue that it seems to me is especially telling. Now, obviously, it pales in many people's mind to what happened in Paris on Friday night. But we were talking about the growing mortality rates of white, older, adult males in the United States, in America. And we were dealing with that. And if you remember, we had a couple of calls last Wednesday, too, I believe, related to this particular topic. And I wanted to just share a couple of things with you before we put that topic to rest. I don't believe that one's going to go away either. I believe that the research is so dramatically significant because it tells us so much about what's going on in our society today that we can't afford not to revisit it, and revisit it in ways that are very, very serious. I had, during our conversations last week on this particular topic, about the increase in death rates, of older, middle-aged white Americans, and I need to add to that, less educated white Americans. We're not talking about, for the most part, about those who go to college. We're talking about those who either quit school and didn't graduate from high school, or perhaps that even did go to high school but never did go to college, or if they did, they just went for a little while and then dropped out but did not finish. The reason that's a significant variable is because if you think about it, going to college involves making some contacts and doing some things which the experts, the psychologists and sociologists believe, help people prepare for the kinds of challenges that may be causing this particular group of people to turn to drug abuse, alcohol abuse, or indeed suicide. It appears that those who do go to college, one of the things that comes out of a college education is the ability to deal intellectually and creatively with life's negatives. And the results often are that those with a college background seem able to find ways to deal with this stuff other than the most obvious, the most dramatic ways. It's the people that don't have the advantage of having attended college that seem to be more susceptible to alcohol, drugs, and indeed suicide. And one of the things that I had started to share with you last week was a related study that suggests that this same group of older, middle-aged white Americans, that is the focus of this particular study on mortality rates, also is very, very prominent in the degrees to which they have, for lack of a better way of saying it, they have stopped attending church as well. They have stopped participating in the kinds of social institutions that help make up our society. I think this is particularly revealing. That particular study used a term that I wanted to share with you because I think it's a term that we can expand upon a little bit and maybe derive some benefit, some insight about it. The term that this particular study on religious practice introduces is the idea of, quote, bourgeois moral logic. That the basic research is aimed at identifying that white social institutions, like churches, like schools, etc., blue collar as well as white collar, have long reflected what these researchers call a bourgeois moral logic that binds employment, church-going, the nuclear family, and the whole idea of the American dream, the idea of upward mobility. What we are talking about here is the nature of society as it has developed through the 20th and into the early 21st century. We're talking about a society which is really on the same track in that its institutions support and feed and resemble or reflect the priorities of the entire society itself. Ironically, what we're talking about here is the same thing we've been talking about for the last 2 weeks here at the Virtual Center, which is the idea of system. The idea that a society's institutions fit, conform to the priorities of that particular society. The structure and operation and values of the family. The message that's being delivered in the pulpits of the churches. The priorities that seem to take precedence in our workplaces. The idea of saving for retirement, putting away a nest egg for retirement. The idea of postponing gratification by saving for another day, as it were. All of these things, which are part and parcel of what we call the American dream, American society, as all of us have grown up believing in it, will recognize that all the institutions of that society buy into or reflect the same value system. In other words, what we hear in church, what is talked about over the dinner table, in most families, what we hear in the workplace, the message that our employers tell us, the emphasis on honesty and hard work and giving an honest day's work for an honest day's wage, and on and on and on. All of these suggest what these researchers have called a bourgeois moral logic. They all make sense. They all fit together. They all support and emphasize the same values. And one of the things that we've come to conclude, I think, in our recent programs, is that this mortality increase amongst older, middle-class, white, less highly educated Americans stems from, or seems to stem from, an American dream that for them seems to have blown up in their face. They've lost their jobs. They can't find replacement jobs. Or if they do find a replacement job, it pays so much less than the job they lost that their whole lifestyle undergoes dramatic change. Many of the things that these folks grew up believing are now turning out to be untrue. So consequently, not only are they abusing alcohol and drugs, not only are they committing suicide at a rate that is frightening, but it stands to reason that they would also bail out or turn their backs on the institutions that were part of this. In other words, if they've lost their job and they have no hope, then why would they continue to go to a church that continues to preach hope when they've concluded there is none? Why would they look toward institutions that promised a world which is blown up in their faces, so to speak? This idea of the bourgeois moral logic, I think, is very, very significant, because it indicates that in any society, The institutions which grow up, which take off in that society, fit that society. They couldn't survive if they didn't. And the whole idea is that what makes a society is that all the institutions which are man-made, all the institutions which comprise that society, are driven by the same sets of beliefs and assumptions that drive the society as a whole, looking at it from the outside. And so, if the goals or the ideals or the dreams of that particular society aren't being fulfilled, then it's pretty understandable to expect that the people who are the most disappointed by society's inability to deliver would also turn their backs on the institutions which feed that value system. The churches, the family, work, careers, and we're seeing it. We're seeing it in terms of the numbers of people who are rationalizing not going to college. More and more we're reading books and articles and accounts from people who say this college idea is a myth. Everybody doesn't need to go to college. Everybody shouldn't go to college. College has become so expensive that there's no way in the world that people can pay off the huge debt that they incur going to college. So therefore, college is a waste of time. It's a waste of money. And there's no problem finding people who went to college and completed college and still can't find meaningful employment. Once that particular attitude or idea becomes prominent, then you begin to see it in lower college enrollments, fewer and fewer people going to college, more and more people looking for ways to enter the workforce quicker. The idea of moving into the fields of technology and doing an end run around the need to go to college. All of this, of course, speaks to the fact that what college is all about is getting a job. But historically, we know that a college education has always been considered to be much more than that. But when it comes to a society which is not delivering the jobs, the employment opportunities, even to those who play the game the way it's supposed to be played, then it stands to reason that that society would experience a rebellion. I think what I'm saying is that the research on institutions not only reinforces the Deegan research on the increase in mortality rates, rather the institutional research surrounding it helps to explain it. If we had been paying more attention to what some of the research on church-going rates and the rest of it might mean, we might have been able to anticipate that the next step, if we didn't do something to fix it, the next step would be an increase in mortality rates among this particular group of people who happen to be the most disenchanted, the most disappointed of any group. And so the question is, why not people of color? Why is it that people of color haven't fallen victims to these growing mortality rates? The answer seems to be that for people of color, there's never been an American dream that was real. From the very beginning, these people have had to deal or adjust to a future that was different from the future that white Americans were promised. So it stands to reason that when that promise is not being fulfilled, those who believed in it the most would have the most pronounced and profound reaction to it. I really believe that what we're talking about here is a reinforcement of the idea of system. The idea that in order to understand any society, we have to look for the ways that all of that society's institutions reinforce and feed the value system, the ideals, and the assumptions which drive that society. If you go to college and you major in sociology, in effect, that's what you learn. By studying different societies and different groups of people within society, you begin to see the origins, the sources of the values that these people subscribe to, where they get the ideas and the issues that they believe in the most. Obviously, if you believe the American dream, if you believe that getting an education and working hard and not shirking your responsibilities and being punctual and being kind and improving your communication skills and dependability and all the rest of it would pay off for you, it stands to reason you wouldn't go to a church on Sundays which preached something totally different. It just doesn't make sense. It stands to reason that the church you would attend would be a church that reinforced and helped you to understand and navigate the values that you grew up believing. And in order to understand societies, we need to look at the institutions that comprise those societies. We need to look at the Constitution, for example. We need to look at the extent to which our frame of government, our political value system, what we call civic education and civic responsibility, fits and conforms the values of the particular society. I can remember, I'm sure all remember, how many times over the course of our programming here at the Virtual Center, we cited the founders who kept arguing over and over that whatever kind of government came out of the Constitutional Convention, it had to be a republic. In form, in structure, it had to be republican in nature. And in fact, Madison made the comment and said, a republic is what explains or helps us understand the genius of the American people. It's what they believe. It's what they expect. It's what they've always believed. It's what they've read about. It's what their churches have preached to them. It's what their parents taught them. And it's what their grandparents taught their parents. So that kind of synthesis, that kind of glue that holds a society together, is what we mean by the idea of system. We were talking here at the Virtual Center about Hamilton's economic program as a system. The whole idea is that the structure of the economy needed to conform to, fit, and support the structure of government created in the Constitution. That's the message that Hamilton brought to the Congress in the reports that the Congress asked him to deliver. In other words, what is the administration's plan for getting the economy underway in this new nation under the Constitution. Obviously, the economy had to support and be consistent with the Constitution. And so what you see is that churches, schools, the economy, politics, the family structure, urban organization, all of these things need to be in sync. They all have to be working in the same direction and driven by the same value system. So it stands to reason, and this is kind of the conclusion here, it stands to reason that if one particular group, namely the group of middle-aged adults, whites that we're talking about, is going in a different direction, if it is experiencing higher mortality rates when everybody else's mortality rates are going down, then it's not too much to expect that that same kind of disillusion and disengagement would be reflected in the other institutions associated with that group. The churches they go to, the families they belong to, the clubs they belong to, etc. I'm struck, it just occurred to me, there was a study done in the 1990s, by a sociologist at Harvard named Robert Putnam. And the title of Putnam's study, it began as an article and then he expanded it into a book. Putnam's study was entitled Bowling Alone. And what Putnam was doing, what Putnam was doing was looking at contemporary American society in the 90s, in the 1990s. And what his research was revealing to him was that there was a major social change underway in America, in middle-class America. It was reflected in the fact that people were no longer joining community groups and organizations. If you were old enough to remember, I know I do, in the 60s and 70s and 80s even, a major activity for working Americans was bowling, was joining a team, getting your team into a league. And the bowling alleys of American cities were some of the busiest places on weeknights in most American cities, because so many people joined bowling teams and leagues. What Putnam realized in the 90s was that the people who participated in bowling leagues and that kind of community organizations to join was declining precipitously. People weren't joining anymore. People weren't participating. People weren't out there interacting with their neighbors like they used to. Along came other sociological studies on middle-class America with their own research, which tended to suggest the same kinds of things. One of the studies that I remember, for example, was one which indicated that in most American cities and most American suburbs, especially in the summertime before we had air conditioning, people used to sit on their front porches, on their steps, on the so-called front stoop. And neighbors would visit and congregate and go next door to have coffee or tea or a beer or whatever. But one of the things that this particular piece of research found is that increasingly, beginning prominently in suburbs, in suburban America, was that people stopped sitting on the front porch and began to sit on the back porch. In other words, they were looking to be alone, not to interact with neighbors. The idea was, this was the finding, this was in the 90s as well, that at the end of a workday, when people came home from work, the last thing they wanted to do was socialize. So what they would do is they would cook out or barbecue hamburgers or whatever in the backyard behind a privacy fence. And that was the beginning of a society where people's priorities were changing from the need to belong to the need to isolate, the need to be alone. The same priorities were reflected in things like how to do it stores like Lowe's and Sears Roebuck, where the idea was you didn't have to be a carpenter or a plumber or an electrician or a contractor or a builder. You could do all of these things yourself. You could do anything. You just go to the local Lowe's or whatever. They'll help you. They'll tell you what you need. They'll even show you pictures and diagrams of how to do it. You don't need anybody. You can make it on your own. You can fix your own car. You can change your own oil. You can add your own extra bathroom in your home. You can put a deck on the back of your house. You can build your own privacy fence. Suddenly, all of this kind of research fit together and was indicating that America was going through a major change in the 90s. Bowling alone, says Robert Putnam. Congregating in the back of the house alone rather than on the front porch with neighbors. Going to your local Lowe's or Home Depot, I don't even know if Home Depot was around then, buying what you needed so that you didn't have to be dependent on anybody. You could basically become independent. You could become your own mechanic, your own carpenter, your own plumber, your own electrician, your own roofer, or whatever you needed. All of this was signaling a major social change. But unfortunately, we weren't in some cases perceptive enough to see it before it was too late. Then when you look back and you see what's happened as a result of those changes, then society scurries around trying to find ways to undo them. Seems to me that when it comes to the suicide rate among middle-aged white Americans, Pope Francis has kind of given us the formula for fixing that. And it's called taking into consideration the moral question and stop considering people as if they're expendable. Rather, looking upon them as if they matter and making sure that they have ways to prove to them that they indeed do matter. I've gone way beyond the top of the first hour, and I apologize. And so we are going to take a 5-minute break. It's about 14 minutes after the hour. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back, and we'll still have about 40 minutes left in our program today. This is the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. Wow, what a piece of music that was. I wish I could claim credit for it, but I can't. I didn't play it, I didn't produce it, I just listened to it, but I enjoyed it. Thank you so much, and welcome back to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. For those of you who are just joining us, I want to thank you for your continued support and faith in the Head On Radio Network, and more particularly the Virtual Center. And for those of you who've been with us since the top of the program, well over an hour ago, because it's now about 20 minutes after the hour of our second hour, I want to thank you for staying with us. That's kind of a vote of confidence that nobody can take for granted, and I really want to let you know how much I appreciate that. Quickly, our phone number is, if you'd like to participate in the program, area code 304-640-6495. Excuse me. If you'd like to email me directly with your ideas and suggestions, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN, 906@gmail.com. And again, I remind you that we do have a Facebook page devoted to the Virtual Center. If you go to Facebook, just type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will see on our Facebook page a number of pieces that I have posted there, a number of articles and several things. In fact, excuse me, the particular theme that I hope to begin in this, our second hour, and which will probably extend over into tomorrow, is in part at least covered on one of the postings on the Facebook page from last week. This was an article that was published last Sunday in the Charleston Gazette, our West Virginia state newspaper, one of the best newspapers in the country, I might add. And I posted it on Facebook and have received a number of comments about it. In fact, I'll share some of those with you as we go. I think, however, that this particular topic is going to be one which is going to take us more than just the 35 or 40 minutes we have available today. My guess is it'll probably continue into tomorrow's program as well, but that's quite okay. Let me open up by making reference to something that occurred to me during the break that I didn't mention, and I want to make sure that I do. And it refers specifically to John's call in our first hour. John's call, of course, was about ISIS. And the point he wanted us to realize and remember is that most of the leadership in ISIS were Baathists, members of the political organization created and put into place by Saddam Hussein. These were people that were totally thrown out of office, thrown out of any particular political or social importance at all in Iraq once we toppled Saddam. And these people seemingly have formed the leadership in the group that we currently call ISIS. Not only is that a valid point, but I think it's a very significant one. And the point that the thing I wanted to emphasize was the fact that it fits perfectly with what we were just talking about. If you go in and you make wholesale dramatic changes in a society, you've got to deal with the value system and the institutions that existed as part of that society, because that's what held it together. It was much more than Saddam, much more than one person. When you go in there and you decimate the entire structure of a society and leave people totally unconnected to anything, everything that comprised their life, whatever that life consisted of, is gone. You go in there and destroy it and replace it with nothing else. You are creating dispossessed, angry, revenge-driven people. And as John said, the chickens, in his mind, the chickens are coming home to roost. I wanted to make the point that John's point was exactly the point that we were making about the increasing mortality rates among middle-aged white Americans. That when their world falls apart, and there seems to be no hope and there's no place to go, but every place they're used to going is connected with the world that has fallen apart, not the one that is challenging them at the moment. Then they take whatever actions seem to be appropriate under those conditions. Whether it's alcohol, whether it's drugs, whether it's suicide, whatever it might be. Many of the Baathists in Iraq, found their outlet in ISIS. It's important that we understand these things before we do something that makes a problem worse rather than better. As I mentioned, the issue that I would like to spend our time on for the rest of our program today, and probably into tomorrow, deals with something that's very, very close and personal to me. Specifically, it deals with higher education. And for those of you who are not in West Virginia, which is where I'm broadcasting from, I ask you to, if you will, please excuse the fact that much of this is germane, pertinent to West Virginia, and to recognize that what I believe the key issues here are pertain to a lot of places besides West Virginia. But it's happening here right now, and I think by looking at what's happening and trying to understand it and learn from it, it might be possible to avoid many of the same issues in other places in other times. I believe that I've mentioned, I know Bob's mentioned on his program, that one of the major things that's happening in southern West Virginia, besides the demise of coal and the loss of the jobs associated with coal and the efforts of the coal industry to try to blame it on the Obama administration and the Obama administration's commitment to stop the burning of fossil fuels, there are an awful lot of negative things happening in West Virginia associated with that. The industry that drove the entire economy in this part of the state for the last 100 years is disappearing. More important than that is the fact that there seems to have been little, if any, preparation, any anticipation that this industry might, in fact, phase out over time. The science has been there. The science of climate change, the science of pollution, the idea of the earth becoming warmer, all of those things associated with scientific findings. Here in West Virginia, since they contradicted the way of life that West Virginians knew, the only way of life that West Virginians knew, they chose to reject the science and to plow on and go forward. It might be acceptable to expect nothing more from many of the people that worked in the industry. It seems to me justified to lay a bit of the blame, at least, on leaders in the industry and the political system which sustained them. The political leaders, the politicians, the party system, if you will, that sustained a one-field industry in this state for so long, that the coal industry discouraged diversification in the economy. it discouraged alternative ways of earning a living in this region. The entire economy and social structure of the region was driven by coal. Coal's priorities became its priorities. Coal's priorities were reflected in the legislation passed in the state's capital. Not only did the industry discourage diversification of the economy, alternative ways of making living, but members of the legislature fell right into line and did exactly the same thing. They never challenged the industry. Rather, they did everything they could do to sustain it and to support it and to strengthen it. Consequently, as science was telling us and warning us of the dangers, and as the rest of the world was becoming more and more aware of what the burning of fossil fuels was doing to the environment, was doing to the air, was doing to the planet, was doing to the water, was doing to our mountains, those who should have known better chose to respond accordingly with the priorities of their own pocketbooks. And now the chickens are coming home to roost here. One of the issues, which of course is what brought me to West Virginia in 1991, is a look at higher education in the state of West Virginia. And one of the things that I think is important to recognize is that West Virginia has some of the strongest and high caliber, high quality educational institutions of higher education in the country. West Virginia higher education consists of more than Marshall University and West Virginia University. There are and have been for many, many years a whole series of four-year state colleges strategically located throughout this state. They go way back into the 1870s, remembering that West Virginia was created as a state in 1863 during the height of the Civil War. The very next decade, the state opened a series of institutions of higher education throughout the state. And of course, these became public institutions, which meant that they were funded with public tax money and coal money, because coal was the dominant industry. The purpose of the higher education system in West Virginia, of course at the beginning it wasn't a system, it became one later on, was to cultivate and nurture the talent of the brightest of the bright in West Virginia. The realization clearly was that because coal is the dominant industry here, that does not mean that all West Virginians are destined to work in the coal mines. There was a recognition that there was talent here. And these institutions were in the business of locating that talent and developing it, educating West Virginians. There's one problem with that. West Virginia higher education institutions, colleges, and later universities did a very creditable job in educating young West Virginians. But the reality of the situation was the opportunities for young West Virginians were not in West Virginia. What quickly began to happen is that West Virginia's brightest were getting their education here and then leaving for greener pastures. Because there really weren't a whole lot of green pastures in West Virginia, because the economy was driven by one industry principally. If you weren't in coal, or if you weren't going into coal as an executive or as an engineer, if your goals lay elsewhere than under the mountains, as it were, then you left the state. And when I came to West Virginia in 1991, I came to work at one of what I believe is the premier four-year college in southern West Virginia, which was Concord. 14 miles away in southern West Virginia is Bluefield State College. And of course, history tells us that the reason there are two four-year colleges so close together, 14 miles apart, all within the same county, in a state with 55 counties, one county, Mercer County, has two four-year colleges in it. It seems like a little bit of overkill. What history tells us the reason. When they were first created in the late 19th century, Concord was predominantly white. Bluefield State was founded a few years after that, primarily for African Americans, for black Americans, black West Virginians. And politics being what it was, as we moved through the 20th century, it became impossible for the political leaders in West Virginia to do anything about that. Because the irony of the situation with, as the region's premier black college, Bluefield State gained a degree of political advantage and protection that seemingly made it invulnerable to state policymakers. When I came here when I was teaching at Concord in 1971, I came here first time in 1971 and taught history here for 3 or 4 years. At that time, during the period that I was here, there was an effort that came out of the state capitol to merge Concord and Bluefield State into one institution for financial reasons. It made more sense. Rather than having two total administrations 14 miles apart, it seemed to state policymakers that it would be much more feasible economically to have one administrative structure managing the two institutions rather than two. I was kind of a young historian then. I wasn't aware of the whole history of the thing. But one of the things I still recall was the velocity and the venom that became clear as alumni from both institutions stepped forward and fought this merger tooth and nail successfully. They were able to defeat it. And despite rumblings since then that there would be efforts to try to merge the two institutions. The fact of the matter is that Concord and Bluefield State remain today, in the year 2015, separate institutions. Good institutions, quality institutions, that are both of which are recipients of national awards. We're not talking about fly-by-night institutions here. We're talking about highly accredited, highly acclaimed institutions. Not too far from these two colleges, near the state capital of Charleston, but about 35 miles, but we need to remember in West Virginia with the mountains the way they are, I don't know how long they'll stay that way, but at least it's very difficult to get around. So when you say 35 miles in West Virginia on two-lane crooked roads can take an hour and 20 minutes or so to get from one place to another. But not too far from southern West Virginia was the town of Montgomery, in the mountains, very close to the state capital of Charleston. Many students who went to school at West Virginia Institute of Technology, West Virginia Tech, so to speak, commuted to Montgomery from Charleston. West Virginia Tech established a reputation as being one of the premier engineering institutions in the country. It was top-notch. Its reputation was impeccable. Is impeccable. I shouldn't say was. Is. Its engineering program has declined in enrollment substantially, but West Virginia Tech still maintains one of the best, well thought of engineering programs in the country. But unfortunately, maintaining a viable four-year institution in Montgomery, West Virginia became financially difficult, especially as math and science skills declined and fewer West Virginians were able to meet the high standards of West Virginia Tech. So what we have here within 40 miles in one of the most rural states in the country are 3 four-year institutions, all of them viable, all of them doing well the job they were created to do, except for one thing. And that is, and this was not within their power, and that was keeping West Virginia's talent in West Virginia. These institutions, for lack of a better way to put it, became tickets out for the state's best and brightest. When you were in high school in West Virginia, you were either going into the mines or you were going to college. You were going to college and eventually planning to leave the state, because that was the only way that there seemed to be a variety of career opportunities open. About 20 years ago, a little bit more than that, a private institution opened in Beckley, West Virginia, which is where I'm broadcasting from right now. And this was private. Its goal was to enroll anybody who could go. I'm not going to get into the history of what became Mountain State University, except to say that 2 years ago they lost their accreditation. They've gone out of business. And they left many students, many good students, hanging in the, as a result. But one of the things that Mountain State was able to do here in the town of Beckley was to build up an impressive campus with a number of buildings, many of them federally funded. In other words, many of the buildings, the bricks and mortar for this private institution, were paid for by taxpayers. But the promotion and creation and support for this institution in Beckley was seen as an economic development driver. It looked like the public institutions were doing the jobs for which they were created, but there were a lot of other people in West Virginia that the thinking was could benefit from higher education. And since the existing public institutions wouldn't serve them, ostensibly because they weren't qualified, then along came a private institution that would serve them. And it grew like wildfire. And through the use of technology and the internet, it developed an internet capability for online classes that caused its enrollment to swell. But in the process, its standards to decline precipitously to the point that a couple of years ago it lost its accreditation. So here in Beckley, West Virginia, in the middle of town, sits this impressive empty campus. And into this void, the pressure built for the state university, West Virginia University, to move into the southern part of the state, take over this campus, and make its highly acclaimed programs available to southern West Virginians. One additional change had occurred, and that is that about 9 years ago or so, I think it was about 9 years ago, it could have been a little bit longer than that, West Virginia Tech in Montgomery affiliated itself with West Virginia University. It became West Virginia University Institute of Technology in Montgomery. And the thinking was that West Virginia Tech was in some financial trouble in terms of declining enrollment and capital needs for upgrading many of its buildings, and that the affiliation with West Virginia University would inject needed revenue and needed programs into West Virginia Tech. Well, it's turned out that the affiliation with West Virginia University didn't or couldn't save Tech. And just this year, in January, West Virginia University made the decision to move Tech to Beckley, onto the campus that already exists here, because the president of West Virginia argued the facilities in Montgomery were in need of over $200 million in capital repairs, upgrades. It was prohibitive. So the thinking was, move West Virginia Tech to Beckley, infuse it because of its affiliation with West Virginia University, supplement West Virginia Tech with some of West Virginia University's key programs, and thereby revitalize the economy of the entire southern part of the state. And that's where we find ourselves right now. In this morning's paper, local Beckley paper, is a feature report on the relationships amongst institutions here in southern West Virginia. The concern is that West Virginia University will bring tech to Beckley and begin to recruit students that heretofore have been going to Bluefield State and Concord, thereby harming those institutions immeasurably. Because let's face it, these are freestanding four-year colleges that, one, Concord just became a university. Bluefield State College is still considered to be a college. They are small. Concord's enrollment is about 2,500 students. Bluefield State's is about 1,500 students. The enrollment at West Virginia University in Morgantown is in excess of 30,000 students. So it stands to reason that competitive-wise and resource-wise, West Virginia University could move its resources into Beckley and literally put these other institutions out of business. The promise was that that would not happen. The promise was that West Virginia University would do all it could to cooperate with Bluefield State and Concord and bring programs in that would complement what those institutions offer, not compete with them. The idea was that West Virginia University coming to Beckley, coming to southern West Virginia, West Virginia University bringing West Virginia Tech to Beckley, would add West Virginia Tech's engineering capability to the mix of higher education opportunities in southern West Virginia, and the result would be the renovation and the development of the entire region. That's the promise that has been driving Beckley and the officials, the leaders of Beckley, throughout this past summer and fall. Beckley believes that West Virginia University coming here is going to be the shot in the arm which is going to begin a new day in southern West Virginia for everybody. The entire region will be benefited. Of course, the folks in Montgomery aren't too happy about this because they feel that with West Virginia Tech leaving Montgomery, there's very little to sustain that community, and that in 3 or 4 years, it'll become a ghost town. The president of West Virginia University, in a major editorial in the state's Charleston Gazette a couple of weeks ago, committed the university to the idea of not abandoning Montgomery, but doing everything that the university could do to help Montgomery find alternative industries and alternative businesses that would make it possible for Montgomery, West Virginia to continue to flourish. But a lot of people don't believe that that's possible. In this morning's Beckley paper is a feature article on this situation. I felt like I had to provide this kind of background in order to lay the groundwork for the discussion that I think we'll be having tomorrow, in tomorrow's program here at the Virtual Center. Basically, what we'll be looking at is the relationship between higher education and economic development. An effort to realistically look at the ways that higher education can stimulate and promote economic development, as well as the ways that it cannot. I think that this particular issue fits very, very well into the context of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Because as we've mentioned many times before, there's no question that education, whether it be K through 12 education or higher education, is a key part of what makes American civic education and civic responsibility an important part of the overall mission of the Virtual Center. So I think the connections that we'll be able to make on these issues are significant. I will tell you that they affect me right where I live, because I spent more than a half century of my life in higher education, and more than half of that at Concord University. So in many ways, I'm bleeding this stuff. I see tremendous potential. I see the possibility of squandering much of that potential. But in the process, I would like to use this situation as an opportunity to examine the whole role of education in our society. As we mentioned in our first hour today, many people are turning their backs on higher education. Many people are saying it's become so expensive that it's not worth it anymore. Many people are saying education, higher education, has become the reservation of the elite only, and that the average people aren't welcome in and can't afford to participate in higher education in America. I think that it is beyond time to address these issues. And the fact that there was this major study in this morning's Beckley paper provides the occasion for letting now be that time. So I encourage you, if you can possibly do it, to make an effort to be with us tomorrow here at the Virtual Center. It is now 58 minutes after the hour, and it's about time for us to sign off. I want to thank you so very much for supporting the Virtual Center and for your continued support for the Head On Radio Network. I want to thank Agnes for handling production today. And I want to invite all of you to join us again tomorrow for the Virtual Center. I remind you, tomorrow, Tuesday, our program will begin 1/2 hour later than today. We'll be beginning at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. For the Head On Radio Network, for Bob Kincaid, Agnes, and their folks, for the Virtual Center, thank you. Have a wonderful evening. Be safe. Be kind to each other. And I hope that we'll be back together again tomorrow at the Virtual Center. Thank you.